Discourses by Mayor Baba, Volume 1, The Infinity of the Truth, pages 170 to 177. Revised 6th edition, 2007. Reading by Susan and Darryl Smith. Source of error in spiritual valuation. Most persons are under the impression that anything which can claim to have spiritual importance must necessarily be very big from the worldly point of view. Thus, to be considered spiritual, an act must have far-reaching effects, or must substantially affect an extensive field of life. They are constantly judging the worth of an action by the magnitude of its consequences. Man is so ordinarily immersed in the objects of the gross world that the dimensions, magnitudes, and quantities of the gross world unconsciously creep into his estimate of spiritual worth and pervert his evaluation. Mathematical infinity. All this confusion is due to the fact that man's mind is often dominated by mathematical ideas, even when it is concerned with estimates of a spiritual nature. But that which is spiritually great is different in kind from that which is mathematically great. The mathematical idea of infinity is constructed by imagining a collection of an infinite number of units, each of which has a fixed and identical value or importance. Actually, such mathematical infinity is unreachable, even in imagination, because for any imaginable number, we can conceive a number which would be still greater. Each unit is false if it is taken to have a separate and exclusive existence or importance. The mathematical idea of infinity thus turns out to be a product of an imagination activated by false assumptions.
Spiritual infinity. Spiritual infinity is not a result of imaginative additions of the false. It is reality itself, which is perceived when false imagination is at rest. The infinity of the truth cannot suffer any increase through additions, nor can it suffer any decrease through subtractions. In fact, nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken away from it, because it is all inclusive and leaves no room for any other, small or great. It is immeasurable, indivisible, and integral. The infinity of the truth remains unaffected by any changes in the universe. All that happens in the universe is phenomenal, and as such, amounts to zero from the viewpoint of the truth. An earthquake, for example, is regarded as an appalling and disastrous calamity by the worldly minded because of the immense destruction of life and property which it brings. However, even a calamity like this cannot in any way touch the infinite truth which is at the heart of reality. In fact, the spiritual infinity of the truth does not suffer any limitation, even if the entire universe is dissolved. Therefore, it is futile to measure it in terms of what is great according to the standards of the world.
Truth, not goal for future. The illusion, which most aspirants find difficult to shake, is the belief that the infinite truth is an object which has to be attained in some distant future, and that all life is just a means for this attainment. If truth were to be confined only to the future and not to the past or to the present, it would not be infinite. It would at once become limited as an event which has its origin in time. All that life is and has is at once deprived of intrinsic significance if it comes to be regarded as merely instrumental to some far-off event. This is definitely a false point of view. The eternal now. Life is not meant to be rich in spiritual significance at some distant date, but it is so at every moment, if the mind is disburdened of illusions. Only through a clear and tranquil mind is the true nature of spiritual infinity grasped as something which is not yet to be, but which already has been, is, and ever will be an eternal self-fulfillment. When every moment is rich with eternal significance, there is neither the lingering clinging to the dead past, nor a longing expectation for the future, but an integral living in the eternal now. Only through such living can the spiritual infinity of the truth be realized in life.
Fullness of being. It is not right to deprive the present of all importance by subordinating it to an end in the future. For this means the imaginary accumulation of all importance in the imagined future, rather than the perception and realization of the true importance of everything that now exists. There cannot be ebb and tide in eternity, no meaningless intervals between intermittent harvests, but a fullness of being which cannot suffer impoverishment of a single instant. When life seems to be idle or empty, it is not due to any curtailment of the infinity of the truth, but it is due to one's own lack of capacity to enter into its full possession. Great and grand things. Just as it is not right to pile up all spiritual importance for some anticipated future, it is equally not right to arrogate it exclusively to things that create a due. The great and grand things of life are not the only ones to charge with spiritual meaning. A thing need not be unusual or particularly striking in order to be spiritually significant. The unusual and the striking exist relative to the usual and the habitual. They are not, in themselves, necessarily representative of absolute spiritual beauty. Thus, it is not necessary for a man to give huge sums of money for a cause in order to be spiritually great. A poor man may be unable to do this, and yet be none the less spiritual if he gives what he can. It is not the amount that endows the gift with spiritual meaning. It is the spirit in which it is given. In fact, a large donation may often be accompanied with pride or some selfish motive, and then it loses its spiritual value. Even a small gift given with humility and utterly unselfish love is endowed with a much greater spiritual value.
Spiritual infinity comprises greatest and smallest. Spiritual life is not a matter of quantity, but of inherent quality of living. Spiritual infinity includes in its scope all phases of life. It comprises acts which are great, as well as acts which are small. Being greater than the greatest, spiritual infinity is also smaller than the smallest. And it can equally express itself through happenings, irrespective of whether they are outwardly small or great. Thus, a smile or a look stands on the same level as offering one's life for a cause, when the smile or the look springs from truth consciousness. There are no gradations in spiritual importance when all life is lived in the shadow of eternity. If life were to consist only of the big things, and all the little things were to be omitted from its scope, it would not only be finite, but would be extremely poor. The infinite truth, which is latent in everything, can reveal itself only when life is seen and accepted in its totality. Freedom and joy in non-duality. Limitation comes into existence owing to ego-centered desires and self-will. Possessiveness in all its forms leads to a life of limitation. For example, if one covets the love of someone, and instead of winning the love of that person, loses it to another, there ensues a narrowing down and strangling of the free life of the spirit, and one has an acute consciousness of limitation. This is the origin of the pain of suffocating jealousy. But if one looks at the situation with a heart purged of longing, the love which is received by the other will be seen in its natural beauty and in the clarity of perception which comes through non-possessiveness. One will not only taste of the freedom of non-duality, but also of its joy. When someone else receives that love, it is like oneself receiving it, since no longer does one insist upon the claims of a single form, having identified oneself with life in all its forms.
Realizing spiritual infinity through non-duality. In non-duality, there is freedom from limitation and the knowledge and appreciation of things as they are. In non-duality alone is there the realization of true spiritual infinity that secures abiding and unfading bliss. The limitation of jealousy is like all other limitations, such as anger, hate, and cravings. They are all one's own creation. All finitehood and limitation is subjective and self-created. With the surrenderance of self-will and ego-centered imagination, there arises a true perception of the infinite worth of that which is. Implications of spiritual infinity for social problems. When the infinity of the truth is adequately grasped from the point of view of non-duality, it also becomes fruitful for the adequate solution of social problems based on duality as an irreducible fact. Mere manipulation of numbers, however clever, can never yield right adjustment between the individual and society, nor can it yield true harmony between various groups which come to exist within the society. Minority and majority. If social claims of a general nature are determined by the considerations of a small minority, the interests of the vast majority remain unreconciled, and the majority remains inevitably in rivalry and opposition to the minority. On the other hand, in democratic countries, the claims of a general nature are determined by consideration of majority viewpoint rather than by the minority. This point of view, however, is still within the domain of duality, where the many exist, and therefore the problem of minorities remains unsolved, since their interests remain unreconciled and the minority remains inevitably in rivalry and opposition to the majority.
Indivisible totality. As long as a social problem is dominated by the idea of numbers and multiplicity, there's no lasting solution for it. The lasting solution can come only when it is illuminated by the truth of the indivisible totality and intrinsic unity of all. The one in all cannot be contacted through the multiplication of the many, but only by shedding the false idea of the many. Any number, however great, is bound to be finite. Spiritual infinity is not a number, however great. It is the sole reality, without a second, without a rival. The world of the many. Where there are many, there is necessarily comparison between them. There is a smaller and a greater, a hierarchy of claims, privileges, and rights. And all valuation gets twisted by the recognition of gradations of different types. From the spiritual point of view, all these are forms of false consciousness, because the same truth vibrates in everyone. The similarity which is experienced in realization, however, is necessarily different from the principle of equality, i.e., that one person is equal to any other single person in respect to claims, right, and worth, but can never be equal within duality to two or more persons.
the one in each and all. On the other hand, the spiritual infinity of the truth has room for the paradox that one person can be regarded as the totality itself. Therefore, one person is not only capable of being looked upon as equal in importance to two or more persons, but even as equal to all. In spiritual infinity, all comparison is out of place. There is no smaller or greater, or hierarchy of claims, privileges, and rights, and valuation remains unclouded because of the unmarred perception of the one in each and all. Since everyone in creation is not only in spiritual infinity, but is that indivisible spiritual infinity, then everyone is first in importance and no one is second. The new civilization. In social life, the recognition of the spiritual infinity of the truth will mean a challenge to individualism as well as to collectivism. It initiates a new way of thinking in terms of an indivisible totality, and it discards all the relative value of comparison in favor of the recognition of the intrinsic worth of everything. In a civilization based upon a true idea of the spiritual infinity of the truth, there will therefore be no problems of majority and minority, of rivalry and competition, and of those comparisons and laborious assessments which so often become a shelter for pride and separative ego. Life then will be infinitely simple and integral because the illusions which create rifts and complexities will all have disappeared.
Jai Baba.